The champagne had barely stopped fizzing in Julian Voss's glass before he was already telling the table how easy it had been. 11 years of marriage, and by tomorrow afternoon, he would walk out of a courtroom owning every brick of Voss development, every account, every acre, leaving his wife with nothing but a suitcase and whatever life she could scrape back together on her own. He laughed loud enough that the other tables in the private dining room turned to look, and none of the men raising their glasses with him thought to ask why the woman he was so eager to discard had spent the last decade watching everything and saying almost nothing at all. He believed the game was already over. He had no idea it had barely started, and he had no idea that in less than 18 hours, a judge would ask him one question that would end his career, his freedom and his name, all before lunch. Before we go further into how a man this certain of victory ended up folding laundry for 12 cents an hour, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We would love to hear from you. And if stories like this one keep you watching until the very end, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss the next one. Julian held court the way he always did, one arm draped over the back of his chair, the other holding a tumbler of scotch older than some of the men listening to him. Around the table sat his inner circle, contractors, junior partners, a lawyer named Daniel Reyes who had built half his career defending Julian's business decisions in rooms exactly like this one. Somebody asked what Elena had said when he told her. Julian shrugged and said she hadn't said much of anything, which he took as proof she'd known all along she had nothing to fight with. He said it like a compliment to himself, like her silence was one more thing he'd won. Nobody at that table had met her family. Nobody had ever asked. To understand how completely Julian Voss misread the woman across from him, it helps to understand how he built the empire he was so proud of. He liked to tell it as a story of grit, a boy from a modest zip code who talked his way into a business degree from a school nobody had heard of, and then talked his way into an industry that chewed up men like him for breakfast. There was some truth in the grit. There was more truth in the timing. 3 months after he started dating a florist named Elena Marsh, a private equity firm he had never approached directly reached out to him with a $2 million loan on unusually generous terms. He told everyone it was because he'd pitched himself well at a networking dinner. He never once asked who actually owned the firm, because it never occurred to him that the answer mattered. The pattern repeated itself for years, always dressed up as luck or charm. A shipping contract that seemed to fall into his lap after one dinner with a mid-level executive. A construction permit that cleared faster than anyone else's in the county. A refinancing offer that arrived exactly when his cash flow was tightest, structured so generously that his own accountant joked he must have photographs of somebody. Julian took every one of these moments as proof of his own brilliance. He never once considered that a quiet, unassuming woman running a small flower shop, 2 blocks from his first office, might have a father capable of moving all of it into place without ever appearing on a single document. Julian would think to check. Elena Marsh grew up watching her own father run an empire from behind a desk nobody photographed. Thomas Winslow had spent 40 years building influence the way water finds its way through stone, patiently, quietly, through the boards nobody profiled, and the institutions nobody thought to investigate. He raised his daughter to distrust people who needed an audience, and when she came home one autumn and told him she'd met a construction developer named Julian who made her laugh and made her feel like the only person in the room, her father didn't warn her off. He asked her one question instead. Do you want to know now what kind of man he really is, or do you want to find out the honest way? Elena chose the honest way, and her father, against every instinct that told him to protect her immediately, agreed to let the marriage happen exactly as she wished, on the condition that certain protections were written quietly into the paperwork neither of them expected Julian to read carefully. The first 3 years were good ones, or at least Elena told herself they were. Julian was attentive when it suited him, generous in the way men are generous when generosity costs them nothing, proud of her on his arm at events where he needed a wife who photographed well and asked no uncomfortable questions. She told herself the long hours were ambition. She told herself the short temper was stress. She kept the house exactly the way he liked it, hosted his clients with a warmth that made his competitors envious of his marriage. And slowly, without ever raising her voice, she began to notice the small cruelties stacking on top of each other like bricks in a wall neither of them was building on purpose. By year 5, the cruelties had names. There was the anniversary dinner where he corrected her in front of colleagues for mispronouncing a wine, loud enough that the table went quiet. There was the charity gala where he introduced her as the woman who used to sell flowers, as though the shop had been an embarrassing accident rather than a business she'd built with her own hands before he ever walked through its door. There was the first affair she found evidence of and said nothing about, and the second and the third, each one a small test of whether she would finally break. She never did, not visibly. She kept arranging the lilies in the foyer every Sunday morning, the way she had since the week they moved into the house, and she kept watching, cataloging, remembering. What Julian never noticed, because he had stopped truly looking at her years earlier, was that Elena had begun keeping records of her own. Not out of vindictiveness, not at first, but out of the same instinct her father had trained into her since childhood, that quiet observation is the only real form of protection available to someone without power in the room. She noted dates. She noted names. She kept copies of documents Julian left carelessly on the kitchen counter, assuming she wouldn't understand them or wouldn't care. She wasn't building a case in those early years. She was simply refusing to be as blind as he assumed she was. By year 8, Julian had begun cutting corners on his construction sites in ways that went beyond ordinary cost saving. Permits were rushed. Safety inspections were signed off on by inspectors who received unusually generous consulting fees on the side. Elena didn't understand the full scope of it then, but she understood enough. Overheard phone calls late at night. Half-read documents in his home office. To know that the empire her husband bragged about at every dinner party was resting on foundations far less solid than the concrete his crews poured every day. The night Julian decided to end the marriage, he didn't agonize over it the way people do when a relationship has genuinely broken. He decided the way he decided everything, quickly, coldly, with an eye toward maximizing what he walked away with. He had met a 23-year-old named Tiffany at an industry event 3 months earlier, and what began as another quiet affair had turned, in his mind, into a preview of the life he deserved instead of the one he'd settled for. He called his attorney the following morning and told him to draft the papers. He told Daniel Reyes he wanted Elena left with nothing, not out of hatred exactly, but out of a belief that anything less would be an insult to how hard he'd worked. He served her the papers on their anniversary, a detail he would later admit, in a moment of rare honesty to himself, he had chosen on purpose. Elena had been arranging lilies in the foyer when he handed them to her. She read them slowly twice, and then looked up at him with an expression he mistook for shock but was, in truth, something closer to recognition. She asked him one quiet question. "Are you certain this is how you want to do this?" He told her yes, that she was going back to whatever she'd been before he found her. She nodded, placed the flowers carefully in the vase, and walked upstairs without another word. That silence unsettled him more than any argument could have, though he dismissed the feeling within the hour, certain, as he always was, that he understood exactly what kind of woman he'd married. What Julian didn't know was that Elena had made one phone call before the sun set that evening, not to a lawyer of her own choosing in the traditional sense, but to her father, who had been waiting patiently for 11 years for a call he'd hoped, for his daughter's sake, would never come. The morning of the hearing, New York City sat under a cold, gray drizzle that felt appropriate for the funeral Julian expected the day to be for Elena's old life. He arrived at the courthouse in a car that cost more than most houses, flanked by Daniel Reyes and two paralegals carrying boxes of financial documents nobody would need to open. He had tipped off a photographer himself, wanting the world to witness his victory. He walked through the doors smiling, waved at the cameras, and rode the elevator to the 14th floor feeling, for what would turn out to be the last time in his life, entirely in control of his own story. Inside Courtroom 4, the wood paneling was dark, the lighting fluorescent, and the room carried the particular hush of a space where something significant is about to happen. Judge Marion Cassell took the bench precisely on time, a woman known for enforcing contracts to the letter and for having no patience whatsoever for theatrics. Reyes stood first, laying out the case with the ease of a man who had never lost a case like this one. 11 years earlier, both parties had signed a prenuptial agreement, independently counseled, ironclad by any reasonable legal standard. Mr. Voss's business interests, real estate holdings, and liquid capital remained his sole property under its terms. They were asking the court to enforce it exactly as written and grant the dissolution that morning. Elena's attorney rose slowly from the defense table. Walter Grimes was 74 years old, semi-retired, with an office above a hardware store 2 counties north, and a professional reputation built almost entirely on wills and small property disputes rather than courtroom combat. Reyes had looked him up the week before and felt something close to pity. Grimes didn't contest that the signature on the agreement belonged to his client. He agreed the ink was genuine, the counsel at the time independent, the document properly executed. What he contested, he said, his voice steadier than his age suggested it should be, was the enforceability of the agreement under Clause 12, a clause he suspected Mr. Voss's own attorney had never read as carefully as he should have. Reyes objected immediately, calling it a stall tactic, insisting the clause was standard boilerplate language about inheritance and had no bearing on the case at hand. Judge Cassell told him to sit down and let Grimes finish. Clause 12, the disclosure clause, stated plainly that the prenuptial agreement became void if either party had misrepresented the financial standing, institutional influence, or professional position of their immediate family, in a manner that materially induced the other party into the marriage under false pretenses. Julian leaned toward his attorney and asked, in a whisper that carried further than he intended, what the clause could possibly have to do with him. He had never lied about his own family, because his own family had never mattered enough to anyone to lie about. It was Elena's family the clause protected, and it was Elena's father whom Julian had believed for 11 years, ran nothing more than a modest regional bank branch somewhere upstate. Grimes turned to the bench and asked permission to call a witness who was waiting in the hallway. The judge glanced down at the name typed on the filing in front of her, went very still, adjusted her glasses, and read it again as though she suspected a clerical error. When she looked back up at Julian, her voice had changed entirely, quieter now, careful in a way it hadn't been a moment earlier. "Mr. Voss," she asked, "do you know who your wife's father actually is?" Julian said the only thing he knew to say, that her father ran a hardware store somewhere in Ohio, a nobody, a retiree he'd met once at the wedding in a rented tuxedo. The judge did not respond right away. She looked instead toward the back doors of the courtroom, and for the first time all morning, the entire room seemed to be holding its breath along with her. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom opened slowly, without force, and the man who stepped through them made every person inside sit up straighter without being told to. Thomas Winslow was 78 years old and carried himself with the rigid, unhurried posture of someone who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. He wore a plain charcoal suit that somehow commanded more respect than Julian's tailored one, carried no phone, no watch, nothing that suggested he answered to anyone else's schedule. He was, the courtroom would soon learn, chairman of the state's Office of Financial Institutions, the very regulatory board that oversaw every bank Voss Development had ever borrowed from, and the quiet majority owner of the specific bank that had extended Julian his very first loan 11 years earlier. Judge Cassell rose slightly at his entrance, an unconscious reflex of respect that surprised even her. Winslow crossed to the defense table, placed one hand gently on his daughter's shoulder, and Elena reached up to cover it with her own, a gesture of quiet alliance Julian had never once seen from her in 11 years of marriage. Julian, still clinging to his ego even as the ground shifted beneath him, demanded to know who this man thought he was, interrupting a closed proceeding. Winslow answered without looking at him directly, his voice low and even. He said only that sunlight tends to be the best disinfectant, and that he preferred open court to private chambers for exactly that reason. Grimes, no longer playing the role of the overmatched country lawyer, laid it out plainly for the record. Every early loan, every conveniently timed contract, every generous refinancing offer Julian had taken as proof of his own brilliance traced back, through several layers of holding companies, to capital controlled by the Winslow family trust. Elena had never wanted her father's money attached to her marriage. She had wanted, more than anything, to find out honestly whether the man she loved would grow into someone worth loving more, or whether comfort and success would simply magnify whatever was already inside him. Winslow had quietly ensured Julian's early breaks and then stepped back to watch, patiently, for 11 years, which version of the man his daughter had married would win. What Winslow had watched, over those 11 years, went far beyond a marriage curdling into cruelty. In his role overseeing the state's financial institutions, he had also been tracking a pattern that troubled him professionally long before it became personal. Voss Development had, over the previous 5 years, filed safety compliance records on 3 separate job sites that did not match the actual conditions crews were working under. Permits were rushed through with inspectors who received unusually generous consulting fees on the side. Corners were cut on structural supports in ways that saved money and put lives at risk, all buried under paperwork that looked, on the surface, entirely legitimate. One of those falsified records traced directly to a site where a foreman named Robert Reyes, no relation to Julian's attorney, had died when a support structure failed during a rushed phase of construction. The failure was one a proper, unaltered inspection would almost certainly have caught. His widow, Marilyn, had spent 3 years being told by Voss Development's legal team that the death was a tragic, unavoidable accident, nothing more. Winslow had, quietly and through entirely proper channels, obtained the original unaltered inspection report, the one that told a very different story, and had spent those same years building a case that required patience precisely because doing it properly, without cutting the very corners Julian had cut, takes years rather than headlines. Daniel Reyes, hearing the surname of the dead foreman and connecting it, with a growing sense of horror, to a distant cousin he hadn't spoken to in years, went pale in his seat. He understood before Julian did exactly what kind of exposure his client now faced, and exactly what kind of exposure he himself faced by continuing to sit at that table. He asked the judge for a brief recess. It was granted, though nobody in that room, least of all Julian, understood yet how little a recess was going to help. In the small windowless consultation room down the hall, Reyes told Julian plainly that he could no longer represent him. Continuing meant defending a client against allegations of fraud that appeared to have directly contributed to a worker's death, and that kind of exposure put his own law license, and quite possibly his freedom, at risk. Julian paced the tiny room, demanding Reyes think of something, anything, some angle that could kill the ledger of falsified records the way they'd killed opposing arguments in 100 boardrooms before. Reyes only shook his head, gathered his briefcase, and told Julian with something almost like pity in his voice that Winslow hadn't just come for the company. He'd come for accountability that had been 3 years overdue. Alone in the buzzing fluorescent light, Julian caught his own reflection in the darkened window of the door, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, didn't recognize the man staring back. He thought about running, about the elevator, about a car with a full tank of gas and nowhere legitimate left to go. His accounts were almost certainly frozen already. His passport sat in a penthouse safe that, by the terms of the very contract he tried to enforce that morning, might not belong to him for much longer. He straightened his tie anyway, out of nothing but muscle memory, and walked back toward the courtroom the way a man walks toward a verdict he already knows. When Julian returned to Courtroom 4, representing himself, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Winslow stood by the window, looking out over the gray skyline like a general surveying a city that no longer needed defending. Elena sat calmly at the defense table, her expression no longer the practiced blankness of 11 years of dinner parties, but something closer to quiet, tired resolve. Julian appealed to her directly, invoking Paris, invoking the early years, insisting that whatever her father had built, he himself had put in the hours, made the deals, earned something. Winslow answered before his daughter had to, his voice even and cold. "A man can trade all the bananas he wants," he said, "if he only ever owned the leverage because someone else handed him the whole plantation." Elena finally spoke, and what she said carried none of the softness Julian had spent a decade mistaking for weakness. She told him she had known about Tiffany. She had known about the others before her. She had known about the offshore accounts he believed were hidden, and she had known, for longer than he could imagine, about the falsified safety records that had cost a man his life and left his widow waiting 3 years for an honest answer. She told the court she wasn't asking for half of anything. She was asking for full enforcement of Clause 12, full ownership of Voss development, and full cooperation with the fraud investigation her father's office had already quietly opened. Judge Cassell granted the motion without hesitation, ruling that every asset Julian claimed as self-made was, under the very agreement he had walked in that morning intending to enforce, the product of capital obtained through material misrepresentation, and therefore reverted entirely to the Winslow family trust. Julian was ordered to vacate the company and the residence within 24 hours, permitted to remove nothing but clothing and personal toiletries. As the gavel came down, 2 agents from the State Fraud Division entered through the side door, not for the divorce at all, but for the falsified safety records now formally tied to a wrongful death investigation. They read Julian his rights in the very room where, hours earlier, he had expected to walk out wealthier and freer than ever. Elena did not watch them lead him away. She was already on the phone with Marilyn Reyes, promising her the real inspection report would finally become public, and that this time it would not take 3 more years. 1 year later, Voss Development no longer carried Julian's name. Under Elena's leadership, the company had been rebuilt from the foundation up around a single principle her father had taught her without ever once raising his voice, that the people doing the work deserve the truth about the risks they carry. Marilyn Reyes now ran site safety compliance across every project the company took on, a position Elena had created for her personally, and one Marilyn had told a reporter she considered the first honest job offer anyone had given her since her husband's death. Financial news covered the company's turnaround extensively, and cameras caught Elena ringing a closing bell on the exchange floor in an emerald suit, calm and unshaken, telling a reporter that real strength was never about being the loudest person in any room. 200 miles away, in a state correctional facility, Julian watched the broadcast on a shared television, folding prison laundry for 12 cents an hour alongside men who had stopped asking him about the stock market months earlier. He understood, finally and far too late, that the quietest person at every table he'd ever sat at had been the only one truly in control of it. He thought about the toast he'd raised the night before the hearing, about how certain he'd been that the game was already won, and about the single photograph he'd managed to keep, not of the woman who left the moment the handcuffs went on, but of Elena on their honeymoon, holding wildflowers she'd picked by the side of the road, looking at him like he was the center of the universe. He had celebrated his victory before the game was even over, and in the silence of his cell, he finally understood exactly what it had cost him. If this story of quiet patience, hidden justice, and long overdue accountability kept you watching until the very end, that's exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. Let us know in the comments what you would have done in Elena's position. Hit that like button if you want to see more stories like this one, and subscribe so you never miss the next case file we bring you. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next.